Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this opportunity to engage in a discussion on current challenges facing parents using cannabis in pediatric conditions. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Jill Swing, who will be available to answer your questions following this discussion. For more information about our participant, please refer to the speaker biography in the center of your screen. My name is Dr. Kenton Crowley, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. This session is interactive, so please submit your questions by clicking on the Ask a Question box located in the far left of your screen and type your questions into the drop-down box. We will address your questions via email following this discussion. Jill Swing is the president and founder of South Carolina's Compassionate Care Alliance. She lives in Charleston, South Carolina, and has 12-year-old twins, Winfred and Mary Louise. Mary Louise has cerebral palsy and a severe case of epilepsy. Lack of positive results from pharmaceutical drugs led Jill in search of alternative treatments. After learning about potential benefits from cannabidiol, or CBD for short, for seizures, Jill worked with state legislatures to legalize access to the cannabis derivative in 2014. She has continued to support legalization of medical cannabis after discovering that access to CBD was limited and whole plant therapies were often more effective. She turned a Facebook group into a statewide advocacy organization in 2017. The mission of the SCCA is to educate patients, lawmakers, and communities on the benefits of medical cannabis. So welcome, Jill.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being here.
Well, that's great. And South Carolina is one of 17 states that still do not have a comprehensive medical cannabis program. What are some of the challenges facing parents who are seeking cannabinoid therapy for their children with chronic medical conditions?
Well, that is a very important question, and I thank you for asking it. It's also a very complex question because there are a lot of challenges, obviously, with our state not being one of those that has legal access to medical cannabis. Currently, we are a CBD hemp state. So for patients who are interested in cannabinoid treatment, that's really kind of where we draw the line legally at this point. Now, the challenge just in CBD itself is multi-tiered. First of all, we don't have physicians who are educated on cannabinoid therapies and specifically CBD, which is what we have legal access to. So when we go to our physicians and we want to have a conversation with them about adding CBD to our child's, medicinal regime, they don't know whether it will be beneficial. They don't know whether it will have interactions with current pharmaceuticals. So there's a knowledge from the physician standpoint. So that is a starting point. And some physicians have taken it upon themselves. I shouldn't blanket say doctors in South Carolina don't know anything about it. There are some doctors who fortunately have taken the time to educate themselves. And MUSC, which is the Medical University of South Carolina, did participate in the Epidiolex clinical trial. So there are physicians who are at least familiar with the Epidiolex, but again, that's very, very limited. Like for my own daughter, she doesn't qualify. We tried to get her in the clinical trial. She didn't qualify because she didn't have one of the two specific conditions for which the Epidiolex clinical trial was being administered. So, and even today, if we wanted to have access to the pharmaceutical Epidiolex CBD, we would be off-label. And so there's questions as to whether insurance and Medicaid would even cover the expenses of that medication. So that's the first tier challenge. And so then going back to staying within the idea of source, right now, CBD is legal to be sold within the state of South Carolina. But again, it's one of those things that's just sort of taken off, and it's everywhere. It's in every grocery store, it's in every gas station. I mean, it's, some retail stores, you can buy it online. And so then so the next question is, how do we get a reliable source, or how do we know that that source is reliable? And as consumers, we're not yet sophisticated enough to make that determination. It's kind of like when I walk into the grocery store in the wine aisle. I mean, I tend to go for something with a pretty label and maybe a price point, maybe not the cheapest, but certainly not the most expensive. And so CBD, as a consumer, I kind of think that that's where we are at this point. It's like, oh, well, which one has the most appeal? Because there's little known about what the contents are in that bottle. It's a self-regulated market, and some products are good and reputable, and others are, don't necessarily contain what they say they contain as far as the label. So that is definitely a challenge. And then we've had instances, I have been contacted previously by parents who actually used CBD for their children, and DSS was called on them. And I know of at least one case where a child was taken from his mother for using CBD oil. He had chronic migraine, and the school noticed he missed a lot of school, I guess, and the school noticed that he was doing better and he was attending school, and they asked if he was taking any new medication that was helping. He said, yeah, I'm taking CBD oil. And I guess they had a concern, called DSS, and DSS, when they came, the parent cooperated. She didn't see anything wrong with it. He was thriving. His health had improved. And like I said, again, it's legal here. But was unfamiliar with what CBD was, did a quick Google search and found out it came from marijuana. And her understanding of what she read was that this mom was giving her child marijuana, and they took the child into DSS custody. She did get her child back, but this was a single mom with limited resources who actually had epilepsy herself, and that's why she had CBD in her home to begin with. Didn't work a full-time job because of her medical condition. So it was a challenge, and it's scary when you think, okay, this is a fully legal product, but there isn't this vast knowledge of what is legal and what is not legal, and there are no protections under the law at this time regarding things like dealing with DSS. So that's just the CBD portion. Now, when you get into whole plant, that is not legal at all in our state. And so right now, our biggest challenge is moving the legislature to get to a point where they see and understand the benefit or the potential benefit of having a safe and regulated market, so that we do have access to products that are tested and labeled and this interaction with our physicians and consultation with our physicians and monitoring by our physicians. So that's the ultimate goal. So I know that was a lengthy question, but there was a lot in there that I felt like was important to share, because I think so many states do have legal access now that many of them may take it for granted, and they kind of forget what it was like and may not have even been aware of what it was like prior to having legislation that provided protections for patients.
So, Jill, how did you get involved in your advocacy efforts?
Well, when my daughter was 6 years old, she was really struggling with her seizures. She's very high frequency, so 800 to 1,000 seizures a day easily. And we had tried a multitude of pharmaceutical drugs, combinations. We did the ketogenic diet. We had seen specialists up and down the East Coast, and we just weren't getting any answers. And her neurologist actually reached a point where he said, I've got nothing else for you. I really have nothing else. And we had seen the Sanjay Gupta weed story, where a little girl in Colorado had gotten access to CBD. That's how I learned about it. And he said, it's worth looking into. And when we did, what we found was that we couldn't get it in South Carolina. And if we wanted to get it in Colorado, you couldn't just fly out there and get it and bring it home, because, even though now it's being sold nationwide under hemp, as a hemp product, back then the federal farm bill legalizing the cultivation of hemp had just been passed, and state legislatures were just starting to get caught up with that. So nobody was actually really growing it at that point. So these were all CBD products that were derived from marijuana. And so this was very early on. And so you couldn't just go to Colorado and get it and bring it home, because that would be considered drug trafficking. If you went there for treatment, you actually had to move there, which means you couldn't really come back. And a lot of people in South Carolina made that choice because they had children who were very, very ill, and they were desperate, and they separated themselves from their families and moved out there. And that just wasn't really a good option for me. So I was actually fortunate that my mother-in-law lived down in Beaufort and had a mutual friend with the state senator down there. And she was talking to this friend about her granddaughter, my daughter. And he said, well, I have a colleague in my law practice who happens to be a state senator. Maybe there's something he could do to help out. So they met, and then we met, and he did some research and found that there was an old law on the books regarding, it's from 1980, regarding legalizing marijuana for certain conditions to be administered through our DHEC, which is the Department of Health and Environmental Control. So he kind of took that at the bare bones of that and created a CBD bill that basically just legalized CBD oil for patients with epilepsy, provided they had a doctor's certified letter stating that they did have severe epilepsy and had failed multiple pharmaceuticals, and that they might benefit from the use of CBD oil. So my mother-in-law and I spent a lot of time up in Columbia, where our state house is located. We met with lawmakers, we wrote letters, we testified, we met the governor's office. And at the time, our lawmakers really didn't know a whole lot about it, but they kind of just said, well, if it helps sick children, how can we not support it?
Right.
So the bill got passed rather quickly. But the problem was, once it passed and I got my daughter her certified letter, I was still empty-handed, because, we didn't actually legalize anything. We just said something wasn't illegal in certain circumstances.
Yeah.
So it didn't provide us with access. And so that was an eye-opener for me, and also for a lot of people across the state who in the meantime, I had actually started a Facebook group, which is the name of my organization, South Carolina Compassionate Care Alliance. And I started this Facebook group because I wanted to provide other parents and other patients across the state with information. Hey, the CBD bill passed, but here's what it is. Here's what it isn't. Because people don't have a good general understanding of how the legislative process works. And they also didn't have a complete understanding of what CBD was. They just thought it was marijuana. And so I would have patients who said, I work in the food and beverage industry, and if it's legal, can I just get something from one of my coworkers and give it to my child? And I'm like, no. So that's really where the background started, was with the CBD bill. And again, I found in my years of doing this that people don't know who their lawmakers are. They don't know who to reach out to. They're concerned that if they are using something illegally now, that if they tell their lawmaker that they're going to get turned in. Yeah. And that's really not the case. I've found that to be quite the opposite, that lawmakers are very understanding and they keep those conversations confidential, and they are very compassionate people. And so I feel like it's my job, because I've been doing this as long as I have, to continue to educate individuals on how to do that.
Wow. What an amazing story. Well, what can parents do now to assure that they're getting safe, good quality products for their children?
Well, like I said, obviously in the beginning, especially, that was a real challenge. And we were very desperate. We had children who were suffering, and it's very difficult as a mom to watch your child suffer. So we networked through other parents in other states, and friends of friends, and got access to whatever we could get our hands on. And at this time, early on, these products were all black market. So one thing I would urge parents to use extreme caution with the sources that they're utilizing, because we were sold products that we didn't even know if they were fit for human consumption, let alone whether they were going to benefit our children. And that was just a risk that we had to take, because we were desperate and we wanted to help our kids. So one thing that I would urge is to make sure you have a reliable source. So how do you do that? Because CBD is everywhere now. Yeah. Like I said earlier, it's on the internet, yeah. It's at the grocery store, it's at the gas station. One thing you can do is I would do a pretty thorough Google search on your manufacturer and find out. A lot of these companies are white labeling, and a lot of them all have the same source with a different company name on them. So find out who their source is. Make sure it's it's domestically cultivated, and also make sure that there's a certificate of analysis. And if a company is not willing to put that, and what that is actually, it's a laboratory, it's a third-party laboratory test. And so if companies aren't willing to put their laboratory test, and it's usually by batch, and the bottle will have a label with a barcode on it, just like any product you purchase, and that barcode will match, that batch will match exactly with the lab report for that product. So that is really, that's the best assurance. And then, like I said, make sure that the company is reputable. Ask around, ask other parents, ask, what other parents are using, because word of mouth is also a great tool and a great resource. Because when we first started out, we were, the very first CBD oil I gave my daughter was called Sunflower Power, and all it said on it was 20-to-1 CBD. Well, that sounded good. somebody told me that's what you needed for epilepsy was 20-1. I don't know. But now I know 20-1 doesn't really mean anything, because you have to know what the 1 is to know what the 20 is. So, it's just, it was a learning curve. And, like I said, I mean, even, we had an occasion where we were sold products that were labeled that had we found out later through laboratory testing that they had no traceable amounts of CBD in them whatsoever. And those companies are out there. They're out there to make a buck. And, fortunately, the FDA has cracked down on some of those companies that have false labeling. But, with so many companies out there now, it's really difficult to for the FDA to keep up with all of them and track them down if they're bad players. But since this is not regulated by the FDA, this is a self-regulated market. Some companies have higher standards and are making sure that the products they are producing are what they say they are, that they are safe, that they do utilize third-party laboratory testing, that there are no residual solvents or molds or microbes that could actually cause damage to patients, making sure that those are not present or are not present at levels where they could potentially cause harm. So being an educated consumer is really vital in this market.
That's a tremendous set of comments and guidelines that all parents should follow. It's critically important to know that the company that you're using is actually legitimate. There's some estimates that there are over 3,000 companies providing hemp-based products in the United States today. If you had a crystal ball, what do you foresee in the near future regarding medical cannabis in South Carolina? And, I was privileged to attend the last Medical University at South Carolina's conference that you put on, and got to meet and spend a little bit of time with one of your state senators, Tom Davis. Give us an idea of how you see, his efforts in championing legalization and your experience in this space today.
Well, I pretty much threw the crystal ball out the window last week when we all got put on shut down because of the coronavirus. If you asked me that question a week or two ago, I might have had a more articulate answer. But today, I don't know that the crystal ball theory is going to be really helpful. And I always do say, because I've done this as long as I have, that I just can't predict what's going to happen at the State House. Crazy things happen. I mean, one day we thought our bill was going to be heard and pass on the floor, and it happened to be Clemson Day. And so the entire, floor was filled with orange, and everyone was, celebrating Clemson. And so they basically ditched the calendar for the day, and then the bill didn't pass till the next day. But, so crazy things happen. A pandemic is not something I could have possibly predicted. So I know that Senator Davis has worked very, very hard this session in, first of all, drafting a really phenomenal bill on the get-go. And, after a few years of this and listening to concerns and listening to advocates and listening to stakeholders and looking at what other states are doing, he started out with a really terrific bill. But then, there's still the naysayers. There's still those who, want to proceed with even more caution, who want it narrower. And so he has sat down with so many different groups, with the South Carolina Medical Association and law enforcement and victims advocates and religious groups. And I mean, literally everyone who has something to say on this piece of legislation. And he has taken that into account And he has, and there are complaints from the advocates, from the grassroots folks saying this bill's so narrow, it's not going to help anyone. But he knows what he needs to do to get that bill through the Senate. Yeah. Once the bill gets through the Senate, we've got the support and the ability to get it passed in the House. It's just going to have to be very, very tightly narrowed in the Senate. And so, I mean, he knows what he needs to do, and he's working that plan. Unfortunately, we were supposed to have a hearing on the bill today in the Senate and Senate Medical Affairs Committee. And of course, that got canceled. We were all supposed to have a hearing next week on the House version of the bill, also canceled. So it's a little hard now to predict. I'm hopeful that they will come back into session and, see the need to go ahead and get this thing moved because, we are in a health crisis. And, I have no idea whether, cannabinoid therapy would in any way help with the coronavirus, but certainly with people's health in general. Obviously we know there are benefits. So it's very possible that they could extend the session into the summer and finish things up, or it may be a situation where we have to start anew back in January. But, that just sort of remains to be seen at this point.
Well, we do know that the endocannabinoid system is one of the important physiologic systems that do protect us against infection. And so just theoretically, it would make sense that if our endocannabinoid system was in good shape, we would be able to weather a viral infection much better than those that had an endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Well, how can parents, patients, and other supporters get involved in your advocacy efforts to help bring safe access to cannabis products for patients like your daughter?
That's another great question. So, like I said, we do have an organization, SC Compassionate Care Alliance. We are a charitable organization. We're registered with the Secretary of State, and we're in the process of finalizing our 501c3 paperwork for the IRS. So we do accept donations, and financial support goes a long way for any nonprofit, as you can imagine. We're very small, but we do a tremendous amount of work. Our involvement with the MUSC Annual Medical Cannabis Update Conference, where we bring in speakers from all over the United States now. That is a huge benefit to the medical professionals within our state as well as interested parties. It's a CME, CLE accredited conference. And so that's part of our work that we've been doing. We also sent several senators from the Medical Affairs Committee to Maryland so they could see firsthand what a very high-tech medical cannabis cultivation and processing facility and dispensary look like, because I feel like they still have so many questions that were unanswered, and seeing it firsthand made a huge difference. So that's where a lot of our funds have gone in the last year, is really, like I said, that education piece. But for individuals, I cannot stress enough, the single most important thing you can do is contact your lawmaker and tell your story and tell them why it's important to you that they support the Compassionate Care Act. There is a link on our website, which is www.stcompassion.com, where they can look up their lawmakers, or they can go to www.scstatehouse.gov and click on Find Your Legislator, and then you put in your address and it goes straight to who your lawmaker is. We also have a Click to Advocate button on our website, so you can click that button and it sends a letter directly to your lawmaker. But I still recommend following up with an in-person meeting or a phone call, just so they can hear your voice and understand your passion and your need for medical cannabis. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be an expert on the bill. You don't have to be an expert on the science. You know your personal story. And that's really what resonates with lawmakers. So there are scientists, there are physicians, there are researchers that are also meeting with lawmakers. So let them do their job. You do your job as a patient and as a supporter of the bill, and share your perspective, because that's really what lawmakers are looking for from their constituents.
That's tremendous advice. And I hope that all of our viewers take that to heart. The voice of voters really does make a difference. And when it's personalized, it even makes more of an impact, as Jill and I have experienced in the states that I operate in.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I was actually going to say that's important. You know, that's every bit as important in a state that has a legal program now, because of course there's always a need for improvement. No state has a perfect program yet. So be involved, and unfortunately, as gross as it kind of seems, be politically involved. You know, South Carolina is a red state, and I've personally gotten very involved in the local Charleston County Republican Party. And this is a topic that I bring up quite often at meetings. We have had medical cannabis panels at some of the Republican Party meetings, and I spearheaded the adoption of a resolution by the Charleston County GOP in support of the medical cannabis bill. And none of that would have happened if I hadn't been, you know, really involved in pushing this issue within my county. So, you know, it really does make a tremendous impact if you can show up to these meetings, talk about medical cannabis, and you know, and tell your story.
Great guidance. Well, I'd like to thank Jill for her informative answers, and thank you to our wonderful audience today for your thought-provoking questions. You may continue submitting questions, and our speakers will follow up via email. That's all for now. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.